everybody. My name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I'm the director and founder of the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy in Media, Pennsylvania. I'm board certified in clinical social work and psychodrama, and I'm an experiential therapy trainer and educator. I'm really excited that you found this video, and I hope that you find it helpful in your work. This is part of an ongoing video series highlighting my recently published book, Social Work, Sociometry, and Psychodrama, Experiential Approaches for Group Therapists, Community Leaders, and Social Workers. In this video series, we'll be going through the book chapter by chapter to articulate some of the content of the book, to warm you up to the book perhaps, or to help you further understand, process, and digest the content and the processes that are outlined in this book. If you haven't already gotten a copy of the book, you can download it for free online at Springer Nature's website, the publisher, or on Amazon through their ebook platform. If you do find the book helpful, I would be incredibly grateful if you considered leaving an Amazon review, an honest Amazon review about the book, so that we can help reach future audiences. So in this video, we're going to be exploring Chapter 6 in the book, Psychodrama and Social Work Theory. So I'm going to go through a handful of the core theories within the psychodramatic system. Before watching this video, it probably would be helpful to check out the video I made focusing on Chapter 4, Psychodrama Philosophy, which really will provide a foundation for understanding some of the theories in this video. So, psychodrama. Psychodrama. Many people think that it's not the best name, and there actually was a movement to try to change the name more recently into action methods or something different. Moreno really chose the term psychodrama to highlight it as the psyche or the soul in action. Psychodrama, soul, psyche in action. He defined psychodrama as a science which explores the truth by dramatic methods. So, psychodrama is essentially a method that uses role-playing techniques in addition to other interventions such as role reversal and doubling and mirroring, interviewing, to externalize internal experiences so that they can be changed, to put into action and explore social situations so that we can better understand them, or practice responding to situations that we might find ourselves in the future. Psychodrama is an experiential method, which means it's more than talking. We use action and role-playing. And it's about working towards resolution of psychosocial problems. Psychodrama is a psychotherapy, and it's much, much more than just psychotherapy. Psychodrama is used in businesses and organizations. It's used as a form of activism. It's used as experiential education. It's used in religious communities, in community work, in politics, in theater, in research. Psychodrama is much broader than just a group psychotherapy, and it can also be used in individual work. Defining psychodrama is sometimes difficult because it's so comprehensive. Moreno in the past defined psychodrama in many different ways. Initially, he defined it as a theology, as a mystical tradition in the 1920s. He later defines it as a dramatic art form. In the 50s, he describes it as a socio-political system, as a method of psychotherapy. He describes it as a research method, and he even goes on to describe it as a philosophy for life. So there's many different definitions for psychodrama. One of the unique aspects of psychodrama is that not only is it action-based, but psychodrama allows us to put into action scenes that we might need to experience for healing, for learning, for growth. there's really no limits to where we could go in a psychodrama, what we could do. We can provide clients with experiences that might be impossible otherwise. Psychodrama is based on the premise that because we're wounded in action, that the healing must also take place in action. That talking about it often is simply not enough. That prior to all verbal language, human beings engage in gesturing, in action, in nonverbal communication, and that the action-oriented aspects of psychodrama might be more congruent with the developmental timeline of how human beings develop and how our communication develops. A prominent psychodramatist, John Nolte, writes in one of his books, which I highly recommend. He writes that the hidden dynamics of our behavior are better brought to view in action than in words, because acting is closer to the deeper levels of that which is unconscious than language. So there's certainly an aspect of free association involved in role-playing, and spontaneous role-playing particularly. Psychodrama is the first body-oriented therapy. And here's where we find a connection to psychodrama and social work, in that social work really emphasizes a biopsychosocial and spiritual approach, and psychodrama integrates all aspects of that into one. That it's activating the biological by involving the body and the nervous system in our interventions. It's looking at psychodynamics through psychodrama and the externalization of internal parts of self and feelings. It's contextually based within the group and the social, the person within their environment, with an emphasis on sociometry. And psychodrama originated from a mystical tradition, a spiritual philosophy, which underlies all of psychodrama's interventions, methods, and approaches. Psychodrama is entirely based on spontaneity. So if you listen to the previous Chapter 4 video, you'd remember that spontaneity is defined as this energy that allows us to have an adequate response to new situations and new responses to old situations. Psychodrama is about training spontaneity, tapping into spontaneity, removing barriers to spontaneity. And that goes not only for barriers of spontaneity externally, but also internal barriers to spontaneity, helping individuals cultivate, develop, and access new responses to reoccurring internal situations. Psychodrama really emphasizes the here and now, and emphasizing the principles acting as if. So, on the psychodrama stage, everybody acts as if the role-playing is actually taking place in real life. We pretend. We sacrifice ourselves to the role-play. We give ourselves to it. We act as if it's actually happening in the here and now. Because of this, my judgment, I guess it's a judgment, my professional judgment, is that when we fully warm up to a psychodrama and act as if it's happening, that the body, the nervous system, the psyche, experiences it as a real experience rather than just as a role play. Which would mean that psychodramatic experiences, role-playing experiences, have the power to correct, to modify, to repair the brain and mind from past negative experiences. The neuroscientists have highlighted the most important neuroscience finding of the century, being that the brain maintains its neuroplasticity throughout the entire lifespan, meaning that the brain changes based on experience throughout one's entire life. And that my judgment is that psychodrama experiences allow us to create changes in the brain, to create changes within the self, to provide experiences that would be impossible otherwise. That within the surplus reality of the psychodrama stage, there are infinite possibilities. We can revisit moments in the past. We can create a vision of the future and step into it. We can practice and train for future situations that we might be involved in. We can step back into our dreams and experience our dreams and explore our dreams. We can externalize parts of ourselves and look at the relationships between all the parts of ourselves. We can have a conversation with God. We can have a conversation with loved ones that have died, with our ancestors, or with future descendants in our family lineage. There's really no limits to where we can go in psychodrama. So, psychodrama's action theory really focuses on the importance of action, of the experiential approaches. Within action theory, there's a couple concepts, one of which is called an act hunger. So act hunger is this psychodramatic term that describes the craving, the feeling within someone to take action in a specific way. So for example, when you signed on to YouTube, you had an act hunger to learn something new. Maybe you had an act hunger to learn specifically about psychodrama, which led you to this video. Maybe you had an act hunger for something else, which was fulfilled and satisfied, and then this video popped up and you clicked on it because it created a new act hunger for you. So act hungers emerged from unrealized, unfulfilled dreams, goals, roles, thoughts, or emotions. Can emerge from role demands that we experience put on us by others. Act hungers can develop through the warming up process as we start to warm up to new actions. Now, when we satisfy an act hunger, we would call this an act completion, that we've completed an act that we were hungry to do earlier, and that we no longer have that act hunger in the same way. So psychodrama offers us the opportunity to satisfy act hungers in a safe way, and to satisfy some of the act hungers that we might never be able to fulfill in real life. There's certainly dreams, goals, hopes that extend beyond the limits of our reality, the limits of what's probable or likely for us to experience in our life. Psychodrama allows us to expand beyond that, to transcend it, and to experience act completions for these things anyway. Now, in the process of engaging in a psychodrama, the free association that comes with role-playing, the action, the bringing our whole body into the process, we often experience what are called action insights. And so this would be basically a function of spontaneity, and it often precedes emotional catharsis, which we'll talk about shortly. Action insights are insights that come to us while we're in action, as simple as that. Insights that we probably wouldn't have gotten to just by sitting and thinking about something, or sitting and talking about something. But that the holistic approach, the action itself, brought us to new insights that we wouldn't have gotten to otherwise. Peter Kellerman, a prominent psychodramatist, he defines action insights as the integration of emotional, cognitive, imaginary, behavioral, and interpersonal learning experiences all into one. Now, there's lots of other psychology and social work theories that really support the psychodrama and also support action theory. Many psychologists have been highlighting connections between action and emotion, which really validates the use of action methods, including psychodrama. Even the etymology of the word emotion, which means energy in motion, or to stir up, to move out. Our emotions really prime us for action. Our feelings and emotions are feelings of wanting to do something, wanting to engage in some sort of experience. Our emotions move us and our body into action. And so this connection really supports the use of psychodrama and other action methods. Now, catharsis is something that psychodrama is well known for, though many people don't realize all the nuances and complexities of Moreno's contributions to theories of catharsis. So, Breuer and Freud were the first to introduce the concept of catharsis into psychiatry in their famous publication on studies in hysteria, all the way back 1895. And so their focus in describing catharsis was about the release of emotions related to past memories. They were working with hysteria, basically complex trauma. Now, Moreno was deeply influenced by Aristotle and also influenced by Freud, although many of Moreno's ideas emerged in competition with Freud in psychoanalysis and in opposition to Freud in psychoanalysis. Moreno's theory of catharsis highlights that catharsis is not just a function of explicit and narrative memory, but also of implicit and somatic body memories. That when the entire self is in action in psychodrama, that we can tap into deeper levels of experiencing catharsis. Moreno wrote decades and decades before Bessel van der Kolk that the body remembers what the mind forgets. And Bessel, who's maybe the foremost leading expert when it comes to trauma and traumatic stress, his most famous book, New York Times bestseller, is called The Body Keeps the Score. And it really echoes a lot of Jacob Moreno's original ideas. So Moreno, when it comes to catharsis, he was deeply influenced by Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. And Aristotle wrote a lot about Greek theater and about audience catharsis when attending the theater. And so Moreno, wanting to create change on a larger scale, he ran with this idea, and it was one of the reasons why he turned to the theater as an avenue for social change. He was hoping to create catharsis for large groups of people at once through the theater of spontaneity. In doing so, he started to notice that his actors were experiencing their own catharsis based on the roles that they played and based on similarities between the roles they were playing on stage in the theater and the roles in their actual personal life. And so he started to experiment with assigning his actors roles on stage that related to roles they were in their real life, and especially roles that they needed to work on or work things out in their real life. And so he described this as actor catharsis, how when we're role-playing, we can experience deeper levels of catharsis. Now, he also explored how spontaneity was related to catharsis, which is an interesting thing. So spontaneity, again, adequate response to new situations, new response to old recurring situations. So Moreno noted and researched how catharsis was strongest in novel situations, novel experiences. The first time we experience something, the first time we watch a specific movie, the first time we do a specific action, the first time our catharsis is the strongest, is the most. And that every time after that, when we do the same thing or experience the same thing or watch the same movie, our catharsis diminishes slightly. So there was a connection between novelty and catharsis. Moreno also noticed a connection between catharsis and relational dynamics, social dynamics. That when human beings are in groups and in the midst of a group experience, a communal experience, a relational experience, that the catharsis tends to be stronger than catharsis experienced one-on-one, individually, when someone's isolated by themselves. He noticed that in terms of theater and psychodrama, that when the roles portrayed on the screen or on the stage, the more similar those roles were to one's actual roles in their life, the stronger the catharsis they experienced. So in 1940, he wrote, "The greater a spectator's social and psychodramatic roles correspond to the symbolic roles portrayed on the stage, the greater is the catharsis produced by the drama." So Moreno writes about catharsis and all of his contributions to catharsis, which also include action catharsis. In a book on hypnodrama, 1950, he writes that the greater catharsis achieved through action is undeniable. The patient is able to express kinesthetically many feelings for which they have no words. So again, we see the connection to the body, to action. Now, perhaps the most important distinction and contribution to catharsis within psychodrama is how Moreno separates catharsis of abreaction from catharsis of integration. Two different things. That what we normally think of as catharsis is an abreactive catharsis. This is when there's a releasing, a loosening, a letting go of, an externalizing of feelings or emotions. Now, Moreno describes catharsis of integration as somewhat the opposite, that it's a reorganization of, an internalization of something new, that it's a transformation of what was there previously. It's integration. And so they're a bit different in a number of different ways, in that abreactive catharsis tends to be much more emotional, whereas integrative catharsis tends to be much more cognitive, but it also has an emotional aspect. Abreactive catharsis is often much louder, whereas integrative catharsis is often much quieter. Abreactive catharsis is often involves externalizing, whereas integrative catharsis is internalizing something new. So there's some clear differences between the two. Peter Kellerman does a great job of summarizing Moreno's contributions to catharsis in the following quote: "To include not only relief of emotions, but also integration and ordering. Not only intense reliving of the past, but also intense living in the here and now. Not only a passive verbal reflection, but also an active nonverbal enactment. Not only a private ritual, but also a communal shared rite of healing. Not only an intrapsychic tension reduction, but also an interpersonal conflict resolution. Not only a medical purification, but also a religious and aesthetic experience." So this is in description of Moreno's view on catharsis and the different types of catharsis. So while psychodrama has a reputation for being able to provoke intense abreactive catharsis, Moreno and other psychodramatists really emphasize that the purpose of psychodrama is to get to the integrative catharses. That catharsis alone is not cure. That when clients cry, it doesn't mean that they're healing. Catharsis by itself might be traumatizing, re-traumatizing, or just reenacting. There may be no spontaneity involved in experiencing catharsis. Catharsis has to be followed up with an integrative catharsis, with integration, with transformation, with an internalization of something new. This is where lasting change is created. So the larger objective in psychodrama is to get to those integrative catharses after the abreactive catharsis. Now, Moreno highlights how, because psychodrama relies on surplus reality, and how in psychodrama we can experience things that would be impossible in real life, that in these moments that would be impossible otherwise, that the deepest and most impactful and transformative catharses are often experienced. That there can be a relationship between surplus reality and catharsis even. So surplus reality is another core theoretical concept within psychodrama, and it kind of goes along with another intervention called concretization. So surplus reality is a mode of subjective experiencing beyond reality that's enhanced through the imagination. So surplus reality allows us to experience physically, in a concrete way, what's been experienced psychologically, or what's going on internally. Sometimes the term surplus reality can also be used to describe the kind of inner imaginal space within an individual, and that we could even describe some mental disorders, symptoms, as types of surplus reality. Flashbacks, delusions, and hallucinations could be described as a type of surplus reality. So psychodrama and its use of surplus reality provides a bridge between the intrapsychic reality of the client and the outer objective reality. And it does this through the intervention of concretization. So concretization is where we use objects or other group members or props to represent things that are non-tangible and invisible. So for example, I could say, I'm going to concretize my strength of personal reflection with my little Socrates statue here. Socrates is always a reminder for me that the unexamined life is not worth living. So a good object to symbolize personal reflection. The strength of personal reflection, self-awareness, it's invisible. It's not something I can hold on to that I could show you physically unless I concretize it. So I can concretize it. I can make it physical by choosing an object to symbolize and represent it. So this is what concretization is. And we use it in lots of different ways in psychodrama. Scarves and other props are commonly used to concretize emotions, to concretize strengths, to concretize memories, or concretize roles or parts of self. So concretization utilizes projection through symbolic representation. We also use empty chairs as a way of concretizing or representing people, roles, or inner parts. So Moreno highlights how there's this existence of unseen dimensions within life that aren't fully explored or processed or expressed, and that surplus reality of psychodrama is needed to work through these parts. Here's a quote from Moreno, 1972, just 2 years before he died, describing psychodrama. He says that psychodrama is a way to change the world in the here and now, using the fundamental rules of imagination without falling into the abyss of illusion, hallucination, or delusion. The human brain is the vehicle of imagination. Psychodrama, in training the imagination, overcomes the differences which hinder communication between sexes, between races, between generations, the sick and the healthy, between people and animals, between people and objects, and between the living and the dead. The simple methods of psychodrama give us courage, return to us our lost unity with the universe, and reestablish the continuity of life. So again, this is a quote from Moreno describing psychodrama just a few years before he died. Now, in psychodrama practice, there's 3 phases of a psychodrama. The first phase is the warming up phase, then we have the action phase, and finally we have the sharing phase. So the 3 phases of the psychodrama, they usually reflect and mirror the three parts of Moreno's triadic system: sociometry, psychodrama, group psychotherapy. So in a psychodrama group, the warm-up is usually sociometric in nature. In a psychodrama group, the action phase is a psychodrama. And in the sharing phase, we utilize more traditional group psychotherapy techniques, returning to the larger group for sharing, verbal sharing and processing. Now, it can be tempting to neglect one of these phases. Moreno used to highlight the importance of warming up by suggesting that there was no such thing as resistance and no such thing as poorly done role plays, just poor warm-ups to that role play. Or that instead of resistance, a client was simply not warmed up enough or warmed up to something else. I've been suggesting through some of my more recent writing that one of the reasons why most role plays in the classroom fail is because professors don't give enough attention to the warming up process. They try to jump into action and into role playing without first warming up the students and attending to the different levels of warm up. That role plays in the classroom and elsewhere are much more successful and meaningful when we attend to that warming up phase. It's where we start to tap into spontaneity. Just like we would warm our body up physically before engaging in any kind of physical action like running or working out or engaging in physically intense work, we also need to warm up our mind, our emotions. We have to warm up ourselves before we engage in emotional work, cognitive work, and existential spiritual work. So we give attention to the warming up process. Then we move into the action phase of the group. This is where we would actually do a psychodrama. When we do a psychodrama, usually in the warming up process, we start to uncover themes in the group. Or we intentionally structure our warming up process around certain themes that we intend to integrate into the action phase. So the warm-up and the action and the sharing are intimately connected and integrated with each other. In a traditional psychodrama, so there's different ways to discern a protagonist, and we'll talk about the different roles and elements of a psychodrama in a moment. Different ways to discern a protagonist. By far the best way, assuming that you have time to do it, is to use sociometry to discern a protagonist in a topic. When we allow the group to propose topics and have the group sociometrically, democratically choose that topic based on a topic that would help most members of the group, a topic that most people relate to in the group, we're always going to end up with more buy-in from the group and the participants, more impact, and we're going to ensure that the psychodrama, the action, the role-playing, is a group as a whole experience. That we're not falling into the trap of doing individual therapy with a group audience, which many group workers unfortunately end up doing. Now, we're not just putting someone on the hot seat and doing their work isolated from the observers and the audience observing them, but that they're the center of attention because they're representative of the group. Their topic, the roles, the themes in their topic and in their goal reflect the themes and roles and topics in the rest of the group, and that's been discerned sociometrically. The protagonist effectively becomes a mirror for everybody else in the group to see themselves. So we ensure that it's a group as a whole process. After the psychodrama, we move on to that third phase of the group, which is the sharing phase. And so psychodrama sharing is a bit different than other traditional group therapies in terms of verbal sharing, in that we often discourage feedback and advice giving. Moreno says, feedback is what happens when two electronic devices get too close to each other and we get that really annoying sound, that feedback sound. We don't want that in the group. Instead, he suggests that it's much more helpful to focus the sharing on group members being vulnerable themselves, talking about themselves, sharing with the protagonist and the group how they related to the themes in the psychodrama, how they related to the feelings the protagonist expressed, how they related to the roles and the dynamics in the psychodrama, what it was like to play a role that they played in the psychodrama, what they're taking away from the process, that it's more so about them sharing about themselves and taking the time to integrate their learning, their experience, going forward, than it is about giving advice or feedback. So I like to tell my clients after a psychodrama, as we move into sharing, this is a time to honor the protagonist's vulnerability by being vulnerable yourself. So it's much more helpful to share about yourself in this phase than to try to give advice and focus on the protagonist. So these are the three phases of a psychodrama: warm-up, action, and sharing. Now, we also have 5 elements of a psychodrama. The first one is the stage. So this is the space where the psychodrama group takes place, where it's held. Now, Moreno designed a fancy psychodrama stage that was congruent with his mysticism and philosophy and psychodrama theories, and it's a circular stage with multiple layers representing different layers of warm-up. In pretty much most psychodramatists, they just designate an area of the room to be the stage. The group room becomes the stage. So the stage doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be elevated, it doesn't even have to be physically distinguishable from the rest of the room. It just needs to be an area that's been designated for the action to take place, for the role play to take place. So the first element is the stage. It's the portal into surplus reality. The second element of a psychodrama is the protagonist. So in order to have a psychodrama, we have to have a protagonist. There has to be a topic, a theme, a story. There has to be roles and relationships that we put into action. And those all come from the protagonist. So the protagonist is the person who's the center of the psychodrama, whose story we're putting into action, whose topic and whose goal we're concretizing, whose goal we're working towards. So the protagonist. The third element is the director. So in psychodrama, we call the therapist the director. They take on a bit of a different role and a different stance than in traditional psychotherapy. And just as the name suggests, being a psychodrama facilitator requires us to be a little more direct than many of us are in our traditional psychotherapy sessions. So the director is the person who's leading the warm-up who's maintaining the safety throughout the process, who's attending to the group as a whole, who's offering interventions throughout the psychodrama, who's coaching the auxiliaries and coaching the protagonist, who's suggesting roles and helping the protagonist put their psychodrama into action using all of the different interventions available to them. The director has many sub-roles, which are outlined by Peter Kellerman. He talks about the director as being a sociometrist, a group therapist, that we have to be present to the entire group, to the group as a whole, to the sociometry within the group, the system of attractions and repulsions, of role relationships within the group. That the psychodramatist is also an analyst, in that we're analyzing what's happening. We're trying to make sense of the dynamics within the group, within the psychodrama. We're making meaning of, we're analyzing, we're offering insights. The third sub-role of director is the therapist. That the psychodramatist, the director, has to be a therapist. And this is about leveraging relationship, about compassion, about understanding. It's really humanistic in that sense. The therapist sub-role of director is really where change for the individual is implemented through the therapist role, sub-role. And the fourth sub-role of director is the producer. And so this is where we tie into more traditional theater, in that the director also has to be able to facilitate the production of the role play, to integrate props, to use music or lighting if needed or wanted, to navigate the production of the actual scene using what's available to them. Sometimes I do psychodramas where I don't have any props, and it's all surplus reality. Sometimes we often use scarves as props in psychodramas to enhance that production. And different psychodramatists have different ways of working. Some are more developed in the producer role than others. So these are the four sub-roles of director. And the director is the third element of the 5 elements of psychodrama. The fourth element of psychodrama is the auxiliary egos, the auxiliary role players. So the auxiliary roles are the other roles that are needed in addition to the protagonist role to make the scene happen, to concretize the scene, to put the scene into action. So if someone's doing a psychodrama where they're talking to their child, the child role would be an auxiliary role. And another group member, or perhaps a staff member, trainee, or student would play that auxiliary role. In psychodrama is a bit different in that it really emphasizes how the healing happens between the protagonist and the auxiliary roles, rather than between the protagonist and the director. So the director is actively promoting action between the protagonist and the auxiliary roles, with the fundamental belief that the healing is going to come from the auxiliary roles and the group members. And the fifth element of a psychodrama is the audience or the rest of the group. And so at the beginning of every psychodrama, there's one protagonist and everyone else is in the audience, the rest of the group. In some psychodramas, there's enough roles that get instilled into the psychodrama scene that everybody in the group is in a role and we no longer have an audience. Sometimes there's clients who don't want to play roles or they decline roles, they just want to observe, in which case we still have an audience. So these are the 5 elements of a psychodrama: the stage, the protagonist, the director, the auxiliaries, and the audience. Now, as you can probably already identify, there's a number of connections between social work and psychodrama. Social work, especially social group work, really emphasizes the phenomenon of mutual aid, which is this core belief that every individual in the group has inherent strengths, experiences, value, and wisdom that they can share with everyone else in the group in order to promote healing, education, and support for group members. And that the primary function of the social group worker is to cultivate mutual aid in the group, to position group members in ways that they can mutually support and aid each other. So this core philosophy is echoed in psychodrama's theories, where we believe that the healing happens between the auxiliaries and the group members, not from the director. Psychodrama and social work also share that they're largely oriented on humanistic, non-pathologizing, and non-judgmental approaches. That they're person-centered. It's about meeting people where they're at, honoring their subjective experience and reality. There's a lot of congruence with postmodernism and social constructionism in both approaches. Psychodrama and social work both emphasize the importance of spontaneity, of creativity, of roles, of group phases, of interpersonal skills, empowerment, relationships, and social justice. There's a ton of overlap, theoretically. Sari Skolnick highlights in her 2018 publication that social work with groups and psychodrama exist in a synergistic union, which I think is a really poetic way of articulating it. When we look at the International Association of Social Work with Groups standards for group work, we can see a lot of connections between social work with groups standards and psychodrama. One simple one is the emphasis on roles, that there's a big emphasis on the roles that people take within families and the roles that people take within groups, which is largely congruent with psychodrama's role theory. The other pieces I already highlighted about mutual aid, about the therapist or the director being primarily tasked with cultivating mutual aid and healing between group members. Social workers and psychodramatists tend to also be similar in their emphasis on the use of self, whereas other professionals perhaps are less likely to use themselves and to offer personal disclosures. Psychodramatists and social workers both tend to have a culture where transparency, self-disclosure, use of self tends to be more commonly used than in some of the other professions, especially psychology and psychiatry. So again, social work and psychodrama, they both really highlight the importance of conceptualizing individuals within their social environments. They both look at not only psychodynamics of individuals, but also sociodynamics within the larger systems that they operate in. Both social work and psychodrama offer phasic models of group development. Psychodramas, again, being warm-up, action, and sharing. Whereas social work, in social work, Larry Shulman highlights the 4 different phases or stages in a group. The initial stage of the group, the beginning stage of the group, the middle stage, and the end stage, and how there's different tasks and different dynamics that emerge within these different phases of the group. That these phases can be a way of conceptualizing the larger, longer-term development of a group from when a group is organized, the initial screening for the group, the initial marketing for the group, the initial push to get the group to come together, the first group meeting, moving into the beginning phase, where there's different tasks focused on establishing safety, cohesion, developing a sense of all in the same boat, a group identity and experience. Moving into the middle stage, where conflict tends to arise, where we renegotiate roles and where we really dig into and move towards doing the work that the group came together to do. Really addressing the group goals, the treatment goals. And finally, the ending phase of the group, which is where we address termination and we consider, where do we go from here? How do we continue this work going forward? So these 4 phases can be considered in terms of the longevity of a group's development, but also in terms of a single session, the initial, beginning, middle, and end phases of a single session. So here's another connection with psychodrama. Psychodrama and social work, they both offer systems approaches that highlight the importance of social justice, of dealing with conflict and tensions within the group and within society. They both orient around empowerment and empowering marginalized groups and communities, emphasizing the dignity and worth of each person. Moreno, pretty much all of his work was with oppressed communities. He worked with children, he worked with inmates in prison, he worked with refugees, he worked with immigrants, he worked with sex workers, he worked with folks who were experiencing really severe mental health issues, such as schizophrenia or psychosis. He was a social worker, very much so in that way, and really emphasized the dignity and worth of each person, which is actually one of the core values of social work. Moreno went as far as suggesting that every human being was a potential genius, that every human being was godlike, that every human being was a doctor. And so he would refer to his patients as doctors, really trying to elevate and empower everyone to the same level of status and power within the group, emphasizing their dignity and worth. So another core connection between social work with groups and psychodrama I mentioned earlier, which is treating the group as a whole. That both approaches really emphasize the importance of the group as a whole approach. That the group itself is the client. That it's not just a collection of individuals in a group setting. That the group becomes its own entity and that the group is the identified patient. So both social work with groups and psychodrama really emphasize a group as a whole approach and really teach practitioners how to work with the group as a whole, how to engage everybody in the group, how to avoid that pitfall of doing individual work with a group audience. So as you can see, there's a ton of overlaps between psychodrama and social work. If you wanted to learn more about these overlaps, I encourage you to check out Chapter 6 in the book, as well as the other chapters where you can learn more. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I'd really invite you to like this video and perhaps subscribe to the channel so you can receive updates about future videos. Again, it would really go a long way in helping the book reach future readers if you considered leaving an Amazon review for the book, an honest review. I would greatly appreciate that. And I'm really interested in connecting with you and hearing how this video was for you, how it was helpful, how it challenged you, what you think may have been missing, other connections between psychodrama and social work that I didn't articulate that you're noticing. Go ahead and put that in the comments section here, and we'll begin a discussion and dialogue together. And feel free to also suggest future videos for the channel. I'm really interested in what you would like to learn more about. As long as it's within the scope of my competence, I'm happy to consider creating a video on that for you. So again, I encourage you to check out some of the other videos on this page and stay connected.